Here are 50 most commonly asked interview questions, along with detailed answers for Microsoft SharePoint developer positions. 1. What is SharePoint, and what are its key components? Answer: SharePoint is a web-based platform developed by Microsoft for document management, collaboration, and content management. Its key components include sites, lists, libraries, web parts, workflows, and apps. 2. Can you explain the difference between SharePoint on-premises and SharePoint online? Answer: SharePoint on-premises refers to deploying SharePoint within an organization's infrastructure, whereas SharePoint Online is a cloud-based service provided by Microsoft as part of Office 365. Both offer similar features, but deployment, management, and customization differ. 3. What are SharePoint features and solutions? Answer: SharePoint features are packages of functionality that can be activated or deactivated at various scopes, such as site collection or site level. Solutions are files WASP that contain one or more features along with additional resources like assemblies, files, and configurations. 4. How do you deploy a SharePoint solution? Answer: SharePoint solutions can be deployed using SharePoint Central Administration, PowerShell, or Visual Studio. In Central Administration, navigate to System Settings, manage Farm Solutions, upload the solution file, and deploy it. PowerShell comblettes like Add Solution and Install Solution can also be used for deployment. 5. Explain the different types of workflows available in SharePoint. Answer: SharePoint supports 3 types of workflows: sequential, state machine, and SharePoint 2010 workflows. Sequential workflows execute a series of steps in order. State machine workflows model a process with states and transitions. And SharePoint 2010 workflows are based on the Windows Workflow Foundation 3.5. 6. How do you develop custom web parts in SharePoint? Answer: custom web parts can be developed using Visual Studio or SharePoint Designer. Visual Studio provides a more robust development environment for creating web parts using C or VB.NET, while SharePoint Designer allows for quick development using a visual interface and JavaScript. 7. What is CAML, and how is it used in SharePoint development? Answer: CAML Collaborative Application Markup Language is an XML-based language used to query, insert, update, and delete data in SharePoint. It is commonly used in SharePoint development for defining views, queries, and schema definitions for lists and libraries. 8. How do you access SharePoint data programmatically? Answer: SharePoint provides various APIs for accessing data programmatically, including the Server Object Model for on-premises, Client Object Model for client-side development, and REST API for web services. These APIs allow developers to interact with SharePoint data using languages like C, JavaScript, and RESTful HTTP requests. 9. Can you explain the difference between SharePoint-hosted and provider-hosted apps? Answer: SharePoint-hosted apps are deployed within a SharePoint site and use only client-side code and resources. Provider-hosted apps, on the other hand, are deployed outside of SharePoint and can use server-side code and resources hosted on other platforms or environments. 10. How do you customize SharePoint forms? Answer: SharePoint forms can be customized using tools like InfoPath for legacy versions or Power Apps for modern SharePoint. Customizations include adding or removing fields, changing layouts, applying conditional formatting, and integrating with external data sources. 11. What are content types in SharePoint, and how are they used? Answer: content types are reusable collections of metadata fields, workflows, and document templates that define the structure and behavior of content within SharePoint. They allow for consistent management and organization of content across sites and libraries. 12. Explain SharePoint branding and customization options. Answer: SharePoint branding involves customizing the look and feel of SharePoint sites to align with an organization's branding guidelines. This can be achieved using features like master pages, page layouts, CSS, themes, and custom JavaScript. 13. How do you debug SharePoint solutions? Answer: SharePoint solutions can be debugged using Visual Studio by attaching to the SharePoint process w3w-exe or using remote debugging. Debugging techniques include setting breakpoints, inspecting variables, and using logging frameworks like ULS logging. 14. What is the SharePoint add-in model, and how does it differ from traditional development approaches? Answer: the SharePoint add-in model, also known as the app model, allows developers to build modular, self-contained applications that can be deployed to SharePoint or run externally. It differs from traditional development approaches by providing greater flexibility, isolation, and security. 15. How do you manage SharePoint permissions programmatically? Answer: SharePoint permissions can be managed programmatically using the SharePoint Server Object Model, Client Object Model, or REST API. Developers can create, modify, and delete permissions for users, groups, and securable objects like sites, lists, and items. 16. Explain the purpose of SharePoint event receivers and how they are implemented. Answer: SharePoint event receivers are components that respond to events triggered within SharePoint, such as item added, item updated, or item deleted. They can be implemented as synchronous blocking or asynchronous non-blocking handlers using netcode or SharePoint Designer. 17. How do you perform CRUD operations: create, read, update, delete on SharePoint lists using client-side code? Answer: CRUD operations on SharePoint lists can be performed using JavaScript libraries like jQuery or SharePoint Framework specs using REST API or SharePoint Client Object Model (SOM). Developers can use AJAX requests to interact with SharePoint data asynchronously. 18. What is the SharePoint Framework specs, and how is it used for development? Answer: the SharePoint Framework specs is a modern development model for building SharePoint customizations, including web parts, extensions, and page layouts. It allows developers to use modern web technologies like TypeScript, React, and Angular to create responsive and mobile-friendly solutions. SPEFs provides a robust development environment with tools like Yeoman, NPM, and Gulp, and supports hosting on both SharePoint Online and SharePoint on-premises. 19. How do you deploy SharePoint Framework SPEF solutions? Answer: SharePoint Framework solutions can be deployed to SharePoint Online using the app catalog or directly to a site collection. Developers package their SPEF solutions as SPEF files and upload them to the app catalog using SharePoint Online Management Shell or SharePoint Central Administration. Once deployed, users can add the SPEFs components to their sites. 20. Can you explain the concept of SharePoint client-side rendering (CSR) and how it's used for customizing list views? Answer: SharePoint client-side rendering (CSR) allows developers to customize the appearance and behavior of SharePoint list views using client-side code, such as JavaScript or TypeScript. By overriding the default rendering logic, developers can create custom UIs, implement conditional formatting, and enhance interactivity without modifying server-side code. 21. What is the difference between SharePoint Framework SPEFs and traditional SharePoint development models? Answer: the SharePoint Framework SPEFs introduces a modern client-side development approach that emphasizes web standards, flexibility, and scalability. Unlike traditional SharePoint development models like Farm Solutions or Sandbox Solutions, SPEF solutions are deployed at the site collection level, providing greater isolation and security. 22. How do you integrate external data sources with SharePoint using Business Connectivity Services (BCS)? Answer: Business Connectivity Services (BCS) allows developers to connect SharePoint with external data sources like SQL databases, SAP systems, and web services. By creating external content types X and external lists, developers can access, read, write, and synchronize external data within SharePoint lists and libraries. 23. Can you explain the concept of SharePoint add-ins, formerly known as apps, and their deployment options? Answer: SharePoint add-ins are self-contained applications that extend the functionality of SharePoint sites. They can be deployed to SharePoint Online, SharePoint on-premises, or run externally on other platforms like Azure. Deployment options include SharePoint hosted, provider hosted, and auto-hosted add-ins. 24. How do you implement custom authentication and authorization mechanisms in SharePoint add-ins? Answer: SharePoint add-ins can implement custom authentication and authorization mechanisms. Using OAuth, Azure Active Directory, or custom identity providers, developers can configure app permissions, handle user authentication, and securely access SharePoint resources using access tokens. 25. What are SharePoint app pages, and how do you create custom app pages in SharePoint add-ins? Answer: SharePoint app pages are custom pages that are hosted within SharePoint add-ins and can be accessed directly by users. Developers can create app pages using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and deploy them to the app web or host them externally. App pages can interact with SharePoint data using client-side APIs. 26. How do you optimize SharePoint performance for custom solutions? Answer: SharePoint performance optimization involves various techniques, including minimizing server round trips, optimizing client-side code, reducing page load times, caching data, and optimizing database queries. Developers can leverage techniques like lazy loading, bundling, and code splitting to improve the performance of custom solutions. 27. What are SharePoint event receivers, and how do you implement them in SharePoint add-ins? Answer: SharePoint event receivers are components that respond to events triggered within SharePoint, such as item added, item updated, or item deleted. In SharePoint add-ins, event receivers can be implemented as remote event receivers, which are hosted externally and triggered by SharePoint events through HTTP callbacks. 28. How do you perform CRUD operations on SharePoint lists using the SharePoint REST API? Answer: CRUD operations create, read, update, delete on SharePoint lists can be performed using the SharePoint REST API, which provides endpoints for interacting with SharePoint data using HTTP requests. Developers can use HTTP methods like GET, POST, PUT, and DELETE to manipulate list items, fields, and metadata. 29. What are SharePoint solution packages, and how do you create and deploy them? Answer: SharePoint solution packages (WSP) are files that contain one or more features, resources, and configurations for deploying customizations to SharePoint. Developers can create solution packages using Visual Studio, deploy them to SharePoint using PowerShell or central administration, and activate features to apply customizations. 30. How do you handle versioning and upgrades for SharePoint solutions? Answer: versioning and upgrades for SharePoint solutions involve maintaining version history, tracking changes, and managing compatibility between different versions. Developers can use version control systems like Git, implement semantic versioning, and follow best practices for packaging, deployment, and testing to ensure smooth upgrades and backward compatibility. 31. How do you implement client-side rendering CSR in SharePoint using JavaScript? Answer: client-side rendering CSR in SharePoint allows developers to customize the rendering of list views and forms using JavaScript by overriding the default rendering logic with custom JavaScript functions. Developers can control the presentation and behavior of SharePoint components. 32. Can you explain the difference between SharePoint Farm Solutions and SharePoint add-ins apps? Answer. SharePoint Farm Solutions are traditional customizations deployed directly to the SharePoint server farm, while SharePoint add-ins apps are self-contained applications that run outside of the SharePoint environment and interact with SharePoint through web services or APIs. 33. How do you implement custom search solutions in SharePoint? Answer. Custom search solutions in SharePoint can be implemented using the Search REST API, which provides endpoints for querying and retrieving search results. Developers can customize search queries, result sources, display templates, and refiners to create tailored search experiences. 34. What are remote event receivers in SharePoint, and how do you implement them? Answer. Remote event receivers in SharePoint allow developers to respond to events triggered within SharePoint from external services or applications. They can be implemented as web services or Azure functions, registered with SharePoint lists or libraries, and triggered asynchronously by events like item added or item updated. 35. How do you use the SharePoint Client Object Model SOM for developing client-side solutions? Answer. The SharePoint Client Object Model SOM allows developers to interact with SharePoint data and functionality from client-side code. It provides libraries for JavaScript, Net, and Silverlight, enabling developers to perform CRUD operations, execute queries, and manage SharePoint objects remotely. 36. Can you explain the concept of field customizers in SharePoint Framework Specs development? Answer. Field customizers in SharePoint Framework Specs allow developers to customize the rendering and behavior of list field values in SharePoint modern experiences. They can be used to enhance the display of fields, implement validation, or trigger actions based on field values. 37. How do you implement authentication and authorization in SharePoint add-ins using Oath? Answer. Authentication and authorization in SharePoint add-ins using Oath involve obtaining access tokens from Azure Active Directory AAD or SharePoint's Oath token service. Developers can configure app permissions, request access tokens, and securely authenticate users to access SharePoint resources. 38. What are the different hosting options for SharePoint add-ins, and how do they differ? Answer. SharePoint add-ins can be hosted in 3 different environments: SharePoint hosted, provider hosted, and auto-hosted. SharePoint hosted add-ins run entirely within SharePoint. Provider-hosted add-ins run externally on a separate server or platform. And auto-hosted add-ins are automatically provisioned and hosted by SharePoint. 39. How do you implement custom actions in SharePoint to extend the user interface UI? Answer. Custom actions in SharePoint allow developers to add buttons, menus, or links to the SharePoint user interface UI to perform specific actions. They can be implemented as ribbon customizations, menu items, or context menu options using XML or JavaScript. 40. Can you explain the purpose of app parts in SharePoint add-ins, and how do you create them? Answer. App parts in SharePoint add-ins allow developers to embed custom functionality or content from external sources directly within SharePoint pages. They can be created using iframes or custom web parts and added to SharePoint pages using the Add an App Part option. 41. How do you implement client-side caching in SharePoint Framework Specs solutions to improve performance? Answer. Client-side caching in SharePoint Framework Specs solutions involves storing frequently accessed data locally in the browser to reduce server round trips and improve performance. Developers can use browser storage mechanisms like session storage or locale storage to cache data and retrieve it efficiently. 42. What are SharePoint Framework Specs extensions, and how do you use them to customize SharePoint modern experiences? Answer. SharePoint Framework Specs extensions allow developers to extend and Customize various aspects of SharePoint modern experiences, including the header, footer, list, views, and command bar. They can be implemented as application customizers, field customizers, or list view command sets using JavaScript. 43. How do you implement cross-site collection navigation in SharePoint using the SharePoint framework, SPEFX? Answer. Cross-site collection navigation in SharePoint can be implemented using the SharePoint framework SPEFX extensions, such as application customizers. Developers can create custom navigation components that retrieve site structure information from the SharePoint REST API and dynamically render navigation menus or links. 44. Can you explain the concept of tenant-wide deployment of SharePoint Framework SPEFX solutions, and how do you achieve it? Answer. Tenant-wide deployment of SharePoint Framework SPEFX solutions allows administrators to deploy customizations across all site collections within a SharePoint tenant. Developers can package their SPEFX solutions as tenant-scoped app packages and deploy them to the tenant app catalog, making them available for all users and sites. 45. How do you implement error handling and logging in SharePoint? Solutions to improve troubleshooting and diagnostics? Answer. Error handling and logging in SharePoint solutions involve capturing and logging exceptions, warnings, and debug information to help diagnose and troubleshoot issues. Developers can use techniques like try-catch blocks, logging frameworks like ULS logging, and custom error pages or messages to handle errors gracefully. 46. What are SharePoint Framework SPEFX web parts, and how do you create them? Answer. SharePoint Framework SPEFX web parts are reusable components that allow developers to extend SharePoint pages with custom functionality and UI. They can be created using modern web development tools like TypeScript, React, or Angular, and packaged as files for deployment to SharePoint. 47. How do you implement cross-domain communication in SharePoint add-ins using PostMessage API? Answer. Cross-domain communication in SharePoint add-ins involves using the PostMessage API to exchange messages securely between iframes hosted in different domains. Developers can implement message handlers to send and receive messages asynchronously and communicate between the add-in and SharePoint. 48. Can you explain the concept of app permissions in SharePoint add-ins, and how do you manage them? Answer. App permissions in SharePoint add-ins define the level of access and scope that the add-in requires to interact with SharePoint resources. They can be configured using the app manifest, XML file, or programmatically using the append aspects page in SharePoint. App permissions can include read, write, and manage permissions for specific SharePoint components like lists, libraries, or site collections. 49. How do you optimize SharePoint Framework SPEFX solutions for performance and scalability? Answer. Optimizing SharePoint Framework SPEFX solutions for performance and scalability involves various techniques, such as minimizing bundle sizes, lazy loading components, optimizing data retrieval, and leveraging caching mechanisms. Developers can also use code splitting, tree shaking, and performance profiling tools to identify and address bottlenecks. 50. Can you explain the concept of tenant-wide deployment of SharePoint add-ins, and how do you achieve it? Answer. Tenant-wide deployment of SharePoint add-ins allows administrators to make add-ins available across all site collections within a SharePoint tenant. Developers can package their add-ins as tenant-scoped app packages and deploy them to the tenant app catalog, ensuring consistent availability and functionality for all users and sites. In a conclusion, these questions cover a broad range of topics relevant to Microsoft SharePoint developer roles, including customization, development techniques, integration, optimization, and deployment strategies. Mastering these concepts will help you prepare effectively for SharePoint developer interviews. and demonstrate your expertise in building robust and scalable solutions for SharePoint environments. For more exciting tips, tricks, and more importantly, for valuable insights of interviews, please share, like, and subscribe to my channel. It has a lot of valuable information about various insights of interviews. It has a wide range of real-world portfolio projects of various technologies for interviews, and it has wide range of most asked interview questions and answers of various technologies like data science, SAP, AWS, DevOps, and full-stack web development, and more. That will be useful during interviews. It has a wide range of most asked interview questions and answers and real-world portfolio projects of various technologies for freshers, for 2 to 3 years, experienced candidates, and for 5 or above years, experienced candidates to test their skills by knowing most asked interview questions and make themselves ready for interviews.